The CIA conspiracy to murder John F. Kennedy, Mary Pinchot Meyer, and their vision for world peace.
Well, she was unlike any other adult that I knew growing up.
Does she set her sights on JFK? It's almost like she sees, here's a man that can do something now.
There really is a sense of destiny in terms of who JFK was.
What they seemed to share was an ideal.
How do we control this monster?
It's really a love story, and it's hard for us, I think, to accept a love story about an affair. Do you think Mary Pinchot Meyer gave JFK LSD or psilocybin, a hallucinogen?
What's the real question here?
And she obviously believed that he needed to have this enlightenment of some kind, given the power and the importance of what he was doing in this journey for world peace.
And that's why they had to kill her. We assassinated a sitting president. Yes, we assassinated his true soulmate as well 10 months later. I feel like before I came into this life, I made an agreement with forces in another dimension to sign up for this task, should it be necessary. This is real. She's not in her body. She's not on the earth, but she is definitely connected to me.
Peter Janney, I want to thank you for joining me on the Maha podcast here.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. I called you a week after reading this book, maybe days after reading this book, which I think maybe my favorite book of all times.
Wow.
I really was so blown away by it. Immediately reached out to our friend and the publisher of Skyhorse, Tony Lyons, and said, is this guy doing interviews? But let me just read the title just so that people have a sense of what we're talking about. It's called Mary's Mosaic: The CIA Conspiracy to Murder John F. Kennedy, Mary Pinchot Meyer, and Their Vision for World Peace. Let's just start out with what inspired you to write this book.
Well, that's a story. I would say, I grew up in the 1950s and 1960s in Washington, D.C. It was a very tumultuous kind of time in terms of particularly what was going on in the 1960s. And I had a father who was a very high official in the Central Intelligence Agency. And I became a rabid Vietnam anti-war protester, in and out of being arrested, really upsetting my family. But I wasn't the only one. In other words, there were a bunch of CIA brats like myself who had similar sojourns in terms of awakening to what was taking place politically. And I did not know about Mary's murder until I came home from boarding school for Thanksgiving vacation. She was murdered in early October.
Of what year?
1964. And that would have made me 17 years old. And the night before Thanksgiving at dinner table, my mother just sort of, brought it up that she had been murdered on the towpath. And I was visibly shocked. It just sort of came in waves.
Because you knew her.
I knew her and I knew the family. I had already lost my best friend, which was her middle child, Michael. And that had been
when you were kids?
When I was kids, 9 years old.
Okay.
But I was still close with the other two children, and I was still close with the family just because we had all grown up together and known each other, that kind of thing. The interesting thing that evening was that my mother did all the talking, and my father just stared vacantly off into space, did not mention a word as to what happened. I didn't reckon with that reality for quite some time. But as I began to get older and look into this whole event, uh, I was training to be a clinical psychologist. I was in and out of therapy all the time because it was really important that I have that experience as a patient.
Yeah.
And this scenario, this story kept coming up. It just kept weaving into my consciousness. That night before Thanksgiving, I remember excusing myself from the dinner table. I had planned to go out that evening, being home from boarding school, hoping to have a little vacation. But I just went to my room and started crying. And I didn't really know what I was crying about, but I knew something was ajar. And it was like germinating in my consciousness as to what the real significance and importance of this event would really turn out to be.
How long after Mary Pinchot Meyer, after her murder, how long after that did you begin this investigation?
I would say that it probably took 12 to 18 months before I really just realized that there was something very important and very mysterious about what had taken place. And then, there were a number of revelations that came out, that she had been very close with JFK.
Did you know that at the time?
I didn't.
The moment you heard she'd been murdered?
I did not know that at the time.
Okay.
And then, continuing, her sojourn as an artist and her commitment to her own personal awakening, and the fact that she eventually was very intrigued by psychedelics, as was I, particularly in college. And, in fact, while I was in college once, I had taken a fairly healthy dose of either psilocybin or LSD. I forget which one that it was, but she just showed up. I mean, it was really real. She was in my head, but, just in my space. And she started talking to me. And, I was saying, what is this? What's really going on here? And she just started saying a number of things to me that I really realized this is real.
Wow.
She's not in her body. She's not on the earth, but she is definitely connected to me. And she's making it clear that she wants to keep it that way. It was not long after that that JFK showed up with her. And the two of them were sort of on me in terms of helping me understand the significance of it. I didn't know at that time what they had in mind, what it is they wanted me to do. But
you feel called to this story.
Deeply. I feel like before I came into this life, I made an agreement with forces in another dimension to sign up for this task, should it be necessary. I don't think at that point they yet knew whether, JFK was going to be assassinated or whether she was going to be murdered in the way that it took place. But I had agreed, so to speak, to be impressed into service should I be needed.
This book, when I called you, I said, somehow you have taken a book that is filled with dark visions of murder, of assassination, and made it somehow beautiful, haunting, hopeful, I would say, in a way, in a discussion of world peace, the idea that is possible, was possible, and why these two people together were so important to that mission. I mean, it's really a tour de force. It really is an astounding read. But let's just get into the relationship, so people know why we're having this conversation, I think
Okay.
is important. But first of all, you multiple times you describe the beauty of Mary Pinchot. In fact, even when she's killed, murdered, shot in the face, one of the police officers there describes how beautiful she was, even having been shot in the face. What was she like?
Well, she was unlike any other adult that I knew growing up. I mean, she was a friend of my parents,
Yeah.
as was her husband. Her husband, Cord, and my father, Wister, were both CIA honchos. I mean, both very high officials within the agency.
Did you know that at the time? Do you grow up? Because we always wonder, is it a big secret? Do you not know? Is dad acting like every movie, like dad's got some secret life? But was it known my dad works for the CIA?
Yeah, but it wasn't known. It wasn't known to me. What did the CIA do in the world? I mean, what were they really doing behind the scenes?
Mm-hmm.
And that only came very, very gradually, as I began to read more, think more, ask questions, that kind of thing.
Okay. All right. So let's get back on Mary. So she wasn't like any other adult. There's this moment you describe where a baseball gets hit in the backyard and she's sunbathing.
Right. Naked. Right. And, that scene really is very popular among the people who follow this story. But it's indicative of just how relaxed and how progressive she was with regard to her own body and not being threatened by cultural mores, in terms of I've got to, protect myself here or there, that kind of thing.
She just you're just a young kid. You
Yeah.
run back there and
She was reading a book, sunbathing, and, her tail was to the sky, that kind of thing. And she just looked at me and grinned as I went and picked up the ball. And I was, of course, a little bit stunned, but it just was who she was, She, as an adult, with regard to children my age and her children, the thing about her was that when she was with you, you really knew she was listening to you. You really knew she was paying attention to you in a way that very few adults of that generation would do to someone else's child.
When's the first time she meets JFK?
The first time?
First time.
The first time was she was at a prep school dance. She was the date of someone by the name of William Atwood, Bill Atwood, who later became JFK's representative to New Guinea. But JFK had just graduated a year before. There's a very posh New England prep school called Choate in Wallingford, Connecticut. And so JFK, had some medical problems. He was sort of in the hospital, out of the hospital, had gotten kind of out of familiarity with being social. So he came back to what was called the winter festivities dance or weekend at Choate. And Mary showed up as someone else's date. And this was the first time that the two laid eyes on one another. And for JFK, it was a major life event. For Mary, not so much. I mean, she looked at JFK as kind of, just the rich playboy type, which really didn't intrigue her all that much.
And he was sort of known for that very early on. Like he's a playboy.
Yes.
She probably held herself in a little bit higher regard, it seems.
Yeah, I mean, it's not like she avoided him like the plague, but, he wouldn't leave her alone. He kept cutting in on Bill Atwood, who was increasingly getting miffed, by that fact. And he really tried subsequent to that event to stay in touch with Mary. And for the most part, he did. And then it wasn't several years later that
We're
JFK.
talking high school, right? Are we?
Right.
I mean, like these are he's just graduated high school.
Yeah, he had spent his freshman year at Princeton, but he had to drop out because of medical issues. And then when he went back,
autoimmune issues, right?
Excuse me?
Some sort of autoimmune issues, or
it was, I forget what.
he was sickly.
He was sickly.
Yeah.
Yeah. But then when he went back to college, he left Princeton and his dad got him into Harvard. And that's where he eventually graduated from. But there were only, for that crowd, there were only 3 colleges anyway: Harvard, Yale, and Princeton. And if you went to another college other than those 3, you were out. You weren't socially redeemable. I mean, that's exaggeration, but that's how they were tied up into that perception.
That's one of the things that was so interesting about your book, that through her murder, through the lens of seeing her murder, which ultimately I think you prove beyond a shadow of a doubt was an assassination, we get a glimpse into JFK's assassination, why they're connected, and it's, so revealing. And I was reading it just as the JFK files are about to be released. I was like, I want to finish this book before someone gives something away. But what was interesting is how all of these people are in the same circles from a very young age. CIA, government officials, so many of the people of the time that you live in, ultimately 50s, 60s, the government there, they're all around each other in so many different ways. So let's, who ends up being a huge player in this too, and is a big part of, who she is who she ends up marrying, Cord Meyer. He's fairly spectacular himself.
Very.
Just a little bit about him. What was his background?
Well, pretty much the same socioeconomic class. He came from a very wealthy family that was involved in real estate, I think. Prep school education, went to Yale, really distinguished himself. And, because of what took place in Pearl Harbor, he went and enlisted in the Marine Corps. And in fact, when he graduated, he was already a lieutenant or second lieutenant in the Marines and went right into combat post Pearl Harbor. Yeah.
And his, again, super well educated. What I found interesting is his involvement. He also is sort of what brought, him and Mary, what they seemed to share was an ideal about what the world should be.
Yes.
How would you describe that?
It was a very progressive, post-World War II, post-nuclear bomb. How do we control this monster that we have created? How are we going to manage this so the wrong people don't get the technology to make these bombs and then, God knows, use them? So there was a lot of, real energy around that for this generation because, Nagasaki and Hiroshima were real events, and the reality of what a nuclear explosion could do was that you could not avoid it.
So their thinking and those like them was, we better figure out a way to get to world peace. We better figure out a way that we never use these things.
Exactly.
It's an extinction event.
Exactly.
And he ends up being invited. Was it the forming of the UN? Or was it the precursor to the UN? He wanted to get involved in sort of that, bringing all the nations together. Right. It was
That was a big deal.
Yeah.
The beginning of the United Nations, and both JFK, Mary, and Cord, they were all at that event.
When was that happening? What year are we talking about?
That would have been, I think, 1946.
Okay.
Yeah. And, I think the event itself left a lot to be desired because particularly Cord, who I would say was really the most intellectually rigorous of all the people in that group. Really,
He got invited sort of as like the executive assistant to the guy,
right.
running the whole show,
That's
right?
right. That's right.
But was the one behind the scenes actually doing all the work and
Yes. Yeah.
and was sort of recognized for that.
He was, Cord was he was a fascinating guy. He was a terrible person from, a child's point of view. I mean, my best friend did not like his father. And I think that's one of the reasons why, he left this life. It was too hard a family for him to be in. I mean, he was hit by a car on one level when he was 9 years old, but I'm of the persuasion that, ultimately there really are no accidents. If in a situation like that, you've made the choice at
You're
the
talking about Michael Meyer, the son of
Right.
Cord and Mary Pinchot.
Right.
So they go. Does Mary know him when he's? I forget how it goes together. Is Mary with Cord at the moment? He's going to help trying to build this thing, the UN, and put this together.
Yes, I mean they're in a relationship.
Okay.
Yeah, and it's serious, and Mary realizes that he is potentially a very important man. A lot of Cord's friends, many who I interviewed, believed that Cord was going to be president at some point. He had the muscle, he had the chutzpah, to really do it. But he was not what you would call a peaceful person in terms of his just day-to-day demeanor. He was argumentative, he was highly depressive, and he was alcoholic. And it was taking a toll on him.
But he came out of that whole experience at the UN like as a real rising, shining star. At the same time, John F. Kennedy is there as a reporter, really, right? Like,
that's right.
Wanted to interview Cord because he was the sort of coming out of that, of all the people, Cord sort of had the light on him and was even sort of started running a new political party, if I remember correctly.
Yes. I'm trying to remember the name of it. United World Federalists.
The United World Federalists.
Yeah. And that the idea was to bring together or create together a world government, okay, as a way to keep nuclear proliferation from taking over or to keep other countries getting a hold of the technology to build nuclear bombs.
And you mentioned what I found so fascinating is at some point somebody writes, I don't know if it's a magazine article, but sort of the 10 up and coming, leaders of America, the young, new, I don't know what the title was, but Cord Meyer and JFK share the first page, and then the others get like 4 per page, but like the two shining stars as sort of in college age or right out of college.
Right.
Were these two guys.
Yes. Yep.
Super. I mean, like just this.
It's prophetic.
It's prophetic the way that they're.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, and they were really regarded as the heroes of the next generation in terms of what their impact and influence were going to be, not only just in our country, but in terms of creating a new level of stability within our country that would have equal ramifications for peace and stability on the entire planet.
Mm. So ultimately, Cord seems to be on this trajectory to be some sort of leader for world peace. He's heading up a new party that people seem to be very interested in. But then his career takes a turn that Mary finds incredibly upsetting.
Well, I think, Mary herself became very concerned with the authority and the machinations of what this country was up to. And she realized that the Central Intelligence Agency under Allen Dulles was, for lack of a better word, evil. And the fact that Cord was being sucked in to the CIA by Allen Dulles, who actually also hired my own father, really disturbs her. And so there's that event, but I would say that the biggest event was the death of their son, Michael. And so that took place in 1956, December 56, that he was killed. And it really, I think, the combination of that, Cord's alcoholism, his depressive nature, they were having a lot of fights. And I think Mary just realized, I got to get out of here. This isn't going to work.
And Cord goes on to be very influential and powerful figure inside the CIA.
Yes.
Telling me a little bit about Allen Dulles, and the CIA, the formation of the CIA, which I think, all things, you get into so many things that are so beautifully intertwined here that bring revelations that, it doesn't matter what we cover in this interview, there's so much here to unpack. I hope everyone reads the book, but Allen Dulles and how does the CIA get formed? What was the point?
Well, it was formed in 1947. It was part of the Defense Act of 94 or something like that. And Allen Dulles was not the first director, but he very soon came into power and wielded a hell of a lot of influence. And Allen Dulles hired many of the main honchos in the CIA, my father and Cord being two of them. There were others, James Jesus Angleton, who's notorious, who, became head of counterintelligence within the CIA. I knew them all because our families socialized together and I knew the kids. I dated Angleton's daughter for a little while. And, we were all being brought up in the social strata of Washington, D.C., going to Mrs. Shippen's dancing school. We were looked at as the next generation of power brokers that would, have an impact one way or another. So it was a very tightly held kind of group and ruled by this sort of class socioeconomic disposition in terms of power passing from one generation to another.
And the original charter, what was the original purpose of the CIA?
I'm not sure. I'm not sure how I could answer that. It was cloak and dagger, but everything else.
From the beginning.
Yeah.
Always going to be
this is
cloak and dagger operation.
Yeah. Coming out of World War II and, the intelligence gathering and intelligence reality during that time, it was a necessary step to take in post-World War II. And, they made it happen.
And was it under Eisenhower that it came about? Or
yes.
So Eisenhower.
Yeah, it was. It happened during the Eisenhower administration. And
he ultimately regretted it. A
lot of people were ultimately regretted it. Yeah. Yeah.
So, and so here you are in this space, so much conversations about the CIA and JFK and, how that all intertwines. But with Allen Dulles, did it, so he ends up bringing your father, a lot of these people that end up really, I would say we have probably taken, what I realize in reading this book is we've taken our eye off the ball when it comes to the CIA.
Right.
Which was the entire, I think, purpose of, getting rid of JFK and Robert Kennedy. We can get into that, but that was sort of the focus. The CIA has never sort of been more in the limelight than in those years. How did it get itself intertwined in government? Like, was that from the beginning? It seems like, there's, I guess, looking at, let me put it this way. JFK looks like they're watching him and he is on track to be president, which I was sort of surprised by in the way you told the story, is that I had the sense that he was the first Catholic. It was a long shot and he came out of nowhere. The way you write it, it looks more like they're aware, they're covering up little problems he's having because he is on a track. So tell me a little bit about your perspective of John F. Kennedy, because I think that that'll give us a view into why the CIA became interested in him.
Well, I think there really is a sense of destiny in terms of who JFK was. And, he was born into a very wealthy family. He had a lot of social mobility. He's a very handsome, gracious guy, war hero. I mean, he had all the accoutrements of what an ideal leader should be or what he should look like. And, I think he also, underneath all of that, was a very troubled young man. I think he had a very deprived family in terms of emotional connection, a mother who was stone cold, so to speak, a father who was, I would characterize as the ultimate manipulator in terms of getting what he wanted, when he wanted, that kind of thing. And of course, it wasn't JFK who was supposed to be president at one point. It was his brother, coming out of the family who was killed in World War II. So the mantle went from Joe, his brother, to John, and one thing led to another. I think it also, his emotional life was such that his proclivity toward, acting out sexually was really, a cry for help. And that kind of activity, when he finally got settled with Mary and they were, doing this thing, he realized that he had a chance at redemption. I often talk about JFK and Mary as being in a relationship of redemption, and it's particularly for JFK. And she really was on him to show up in a way that no one had ever demanded that he do so. I mean, she basically put it to him, look, do you want to be your father's puppet? Is that what it is? Or do you want to be your own person? Do you want to be your own man? What kind of president do you really want to be? What kind of influence do you really want to have in the world? And particularly around the time where JFK was negotiating with Khrushchev, after, during the Cuban Missile Crisis, after, the Bay of Pigs before that. I mean, she realized and helped him see, do you realize what an opportunity you have here? He wants the same thing that you do. How are you going to work with him to make this a reality? And the two of them really became friends. I mean, they really became interested in one another, realizing that their power together was so much greater than their power alone.
How do you know that? I mean, as an investigator, as an author, and doing this work, what were the details that, I mean, someone could be watching this and say, I mean, whatever, it's his perspective, but what would you say is the evidence that their relationship was this important to each other?
Well, just The documents that I, read and studied in terms of what was taking place for Khrushchev, for instance, during the Cuban Missile Crisis.
Right.
He really realized that, yes, there was a huge opportunity here, but there could also be a nuclear Armageddon if we don't handle this situation well.
And they both did something, I think, very fascinating. They both seemed to not trust. In this case, John F. Kennedy didn't trust the CIA. Khrushchev thought the KGB was watching everything he was doing. And so they really created a private, reached out through different sources. We've got to figure out a way to communicate and leave our generals and military out of this, or we're never going to get to peace. They were both recognizing the people around us are driving us into war.
Absolutely correct.
With each other.
Absolutely correct. Yes. And so subsequent, for instance, to the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962, they both realized that they could be messengers for a world peace. And they both wanted to continue this collaboration and sense of trust that had taken place between the two of them. People don't know, or they forget, Khrushchev was very upset when Kennedy was assassinated. He realized that this was a very bad, dark event that could really just irrevocably change things for the worse. And, he had to reckon with that.
There's, when we think of the Cuban Missile Crisis, some of what's happening there, his CIA is driving him into Cuba, tried to trick him into by, launching Bay of Pigs, getting in there, and then JFK just does not follow through.
Right.
I mean, this is where the CIA thinks they've got the jig is up, that they've got him,
right,
that they could force him to make this move. And what do you think that was like when the CIA realized, oh my God, this president just foiled our entire plot to,
Well, I think it was, a very rude awakening. On the other hand, for JFK and, with Mary's help, it was a defining moment for him as a leader to really, it was an opportunity for him to stand up and define himself to the world in terms of he was not going to allow himself to be manipulated.
Right. You keep mentioning Mary with Mary's help. What involvement did she have at that time? What sources or, in this investigation, how do you know she's there? How do you know she's a part of the conversation?
It's basically has to do with the people around Mary who knew her and, knew the situation, what their recollection was. I was in a very, peculiar place because being who I was, growing up where I had grown up, my father being who he had been, when I really started to take this project on, I approached a lot of Mary's old friends who they didn't want to talk to me initially, but I kept pressing them and I kept telling them, what I was discovering and why this was important. So, a number of them caved and agreed to talk to me, but, they didn't want me to advertise the fact that they had. So I was getting some really wonderful information and tidbits about what was going on behind the scenes. And that's what I think is so fascinating about this story, and which I really tried to, incorporate into the story I was telling, because it is a very integral dimension of understanding the politics of what was really taking place on a deeper level, not just between the Mary and JFK, but through all the power brokers in Washington, because they're all basically of the same socioeconomic class, and they know each other. Their families know each other. I mean, talk about inbred. It's it's bigger than you can even conceptualize.
So Mary, you see her on multiple guest lists, very important meetings, small groups of people that she's being invited. So you do have this evidence that for some reason, beyond whatever, sexual relationship they're having, she's clearly being invited to meetings where very important people
Yes.
are around.
She was not a bimbo.
Right. Right.
I mean, the important people in Washington recognize, whoa, this is a woman who really knows her stuff. She means business. She's smart. She's well educated. We don't want to cross her. We don't want to agitate her in a certain way because that could create havoc. And it was on the verge of doing so, and that's why they had to kill her.
And it almost seems like she had found Cord Meyer and was like yourself, but, in a different generation. She wanted world peace. She saw, this is my avenue. He gives up on it and gets sucked into the CIA, literally like the exact opposite of what she fell in love with, or the dream she had of what I think her place was in this world. And then she, does she set her sights on JFK? It's almost like she sees, here's a man that can do something now, that really has gotten himself into a position. How do they come together at that point? Because, we see that she'd met in, high school. They run into each other several times, but where does the relationship really start to get serious?
I would say after the UN conference is when it really starts to take effect. And, there was this cocktail party at Ben Bradley's house where a number of people said, you could see that there was something between them, and it was palpable.
Was he president at that point? Yeah.
No.
Okay. So
no.
Okay.
No. And, I interviewed Ben a couple of times. The second time his dementia had, kicked in a lot. But I really did get some interesting material out of him the first time I interviewed him. And, I think he realized that he reluctantly told me things that he shouldn't have. And because I wrote about it, and, he never told me he was upset about what I had said, but I knew that he was. But what could I do? It was the truth,
And Ben claimed he wasn't CIA. Wasn't that his thing? I'm not the CIA. I'm not in the CIA. But am I right about that? But you piece together that clearly he was, if not in the CIA, being used by the CIA.
Absolutely.
Very powerful position.
Yeah. I mean, his position within the Washington Post then, before he became executive editor, but he was...
So tell me a little bit about that. So he's in the newspaper in business.
Right. And, Ben is, once again, kind of very well-to-do, Harvard-educated family. He wields a lot of power. And, he married, for a while, he was married to Mary's sister. So, he and Jack were quite close friends for a period of time. So Ben had a front row seat to sort of what was going on. And I'm not sure when I talked to him the first time, he could bring it all into focus for me. But he brought enough in for me to fill in the gaps through what other people had told me, just in terms of what was taking place.
As the tensions around JFK not going along with where the CIA wants him going, pushing wars, he's moving the opposite direction, even says, I'm going to smash the CIA and break into a million pieces.
Right.
Meanwhile, Bradley, you get a lot into, am I correct? Is it Operation Paperclip? Is that the right one? I always get them confused. Mockingbird, the CIA's infiltration of media. Um, how does that play in here?
Well, the people who were in the CIA at that time, they're not stupid. I mean, they are doing all kinds of things behind the scenes to decipher and get whatever it is they need to get. And they will murder people in order to get it if that's what it's going to take. So, I think Ben tried to, at one point, turn away from seeing the evil and ugliness of what was going on. But things just, around right before Dallas and right after, it was out of control. It just was out of control. And so sooner or later, the chickens come home to roost. And increasingly, subsequent to Dallas, we begin to realize that Lee Harvey Oswald didn't shoot JFK. This was a government murder killing a sitting president because he is not going to toe the line of what the government or the high-level people in the government, people within the CIA, are going to do. And when they realize that they cannot control him, then they have to really reckon with, do we need to take this guy out? Or what are we going to do here?
You got into some details, and I'm by no means a historian of this. In fact, this is probably the first time I've really, dove into the assassination of JFK, other than watching Oliver Stone's movie, which you reference here as having been fairly accurate.
Yes, I think it is fairly accurate. And I know Oliver a bit, and I've sat with him and I've talked with him, and I not only respect him as an artist, but I respect him in terms of his real commitment to wanting to bring the truth to light. And I think that's why that movie was so important. It really catalyzed a lot of people to awaken. And that is critically important in a democracy.
You talk about a stop after JFK is shot in Dallas. I didn't realize there was 2 different hospitals he ended up going to. And the first one, your perspective is they changed the wounds on JFK.
Right.
Tell me a little bit about that for someone that doesn't know what we're...
They took him to this place in Bethesda, I can't remember, where they did the autopsy. Okay. And the wounds during the autopsy were altered to make it look like the likelihood of a lone nut gun shooter was responsible for creating the wounds, whereas there really were 3 teams, so to speak, that were responsible for just making sure he would not live that day.
How many bullets do you think were involved in this?
Oh, boy, it's been a long time since I got into the weeds of that, but I would say probably 4 to 6 ultimately.
Wow.
Doesn't mean that there were 4 to 6 wounds, but there were 3 teams of shooters. And, what happened in the Texas School Depository Building is it's just a facade.
What's that? Tell me about that.
Well, that's where, Lee Harvey Oswald was on the 6th floor and, was fated. That's where he took his shots. That can't remember the first one missed, but the third one hit. Oswald was a terrible marksman. I don't think he was really responsible for, hitting the president. It was, the shooter on the grassy knoll, for instance, that really had the biggest shot that just, blew half of JFK's head off. Uh,
Just when we think of Jacqueline Kennedy in that position, I mean, she's sitting right there. What are your thoughts of Jacqueline Kennedy?
well, I think ultimately she was more of a courageous woman than people gave her credit for. Uh, Maybe not during initially of what happened, but she did come to have an epiphany about this whole thing that had taken place. And she did come to believe, that this was real evil involved in terms of what took place for JFK. And of course, why wouldn't it take her some time to really reckon with the impact of what the truth really was? But I give her a lot of credit for, in the end, standing up on her 2 feet, defending her family, defending her children, and trying to lead a good life where she was not going to be duped by what the government wanted her to defend.
Do you think her, John F. Kennedy and Jacqueline Kennedy, did they love each other? Because, I mean, what's interesting about this book is it's really a love story. And it's hard for us, I think, to accept a love story about an affair, especially with really probably the closest thing to a king and queen we've had in this country.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
So to defile that story with a love story, you do it beautifully. And it really does. I guess it feels like love. So how would you describe, it feels like love between Mary Pinchot and John F. Kennedy. How would you describe the relationship Jacqueline Kennedy has with John?
She was the mother of his 2 children. I mean, that's huge. He loved his kids. He really did. And, I think he realized that his own character and own securities were such that he didn't really marry Jackie for the right reasons. He was not in love with Jackie in the way that he came to be in love with Mary. But nonetheless, people invent all kinds of reasons for staying in a marriage or, living it out in a certain way. And it's not like Jack hated Jackie or anything like that. As I said, she was the mother of his children, and, he was going to support her and respect her, if only for that. But it wasn't the kind of relationship that really catalyzed gears in his consciousness in the way that Mary did. He realized, as I said earlier, that his relationship with Mary really was his chance at redemption, because he'd been a very troubled young man growing up in the way that he did. And she really demanded that he show up with whatever vulnerabilities were part of his life and sit with them with her and not hide. She forced him to, look, if you want to play with me, this is what you're going to have to do. I'm not going to let you get away with this or that. I'm going to call you out every time I see it going on. What kind of a man do you want to be? What kind of a president do you want to be? Do you want to be really something outstanding like you could, or do you want to just toe some mediocre line and settle?
You also mentioned she challenged, do you want to be a puppet to Joe, your father, and you said great manipulator. He manipulated Jacqueline Kennedy too. I mean, essentially made a business deal to stay when she wasn't happy, right? So it feels like for John F. Kennedy, everything in his world is being, not everything, but a lot of it is being manipulated by his father. The father's getting involved in a relationship, pulling Jacqueline Kennedy aside, offering her a business transaction, essentially.
Yes.
What was that? You know what that transaction? What was that? What was sort of discussed there?
Well, I think what was discussed was giving her a large sum of money. She wanted to leave Jack and get out of, just divorce him. And Joe,
in the middle of the presidency,
or right before.
Or right before.
Yeah,
okay.
I mean, the upshot of it was it would have ruined Jack politically had that taken place. And so his father was hell-bent on doing anything he could to keep it from happening. I was at the inauguration of Kennedy in Washington, because of my father. We got these incredible seats. I sat right across the street from Joe Kennedy and the family. And I remember vividly, that when the car came down the street, his father stood up, took off his top hat, and, really kind of bowed in a way that only Joe Kennedy could bow at that moment in terms of honoring, his son and what he had been able to do for his son.
There's so many beautiful things that weave in here, but I want to, I think get into why the murder of Mary Pinchot pulls this all together. Tell me what we were told. What was the story? How was she killed as far? And most media, it's never really been followed up. The reigning story of how Mary Pinchot is murdered is what?
I'm sorry.
The story, how is the story told? Who killed her, as far as not on your investigation, but what, is still in the record books as what took place?
Well, there's a character that comes into play at this juncture, and she's a young Black attorney. She's actually the first African-American woman to enter the D.C. bar. Her name is Dovey Roundtree. And when Mary was murdered, they immediately tried to pin it on this Black guy. His name is Ray Crump. And Dovey volunteered to be his attorney, took it on for free, because she realized what a phony this whole thing was, that this is what they were going to try to do. And ultimately, she gets him acquitted because the evidence is just not there for Ray Crump to have murdered Mary or anyone. He just incapable.
Right.
So that, again, kind of blows this whole case out of the water in the same way that, JFK's murder is left with so many unresolved pieces just hanging and blowing in the wind. And so we move then into, okay, well, what really happened?
And just to very summarize it very quickly, Ray Crump is, has taken the afternoon in this park. He's said to go fishing, really to meet with another woman. He's married. He's, having
Vivian is her name.
Vivian. He's meeting this woman, Vivian, drinking, falls asleep by a river. He gets framed with this entire thing. He's not the right size of what, like from different witnesses that, saw a man standing over the dead body. The fight, Mary Pinchot clearly gets shot, right? Tell me about that. Just the struggle around it is pretty astounding because,
the actual murder.
Yeah,
itself.
The actual murder. She gets shot in the face and is still struggling to get away.
Well, she gets shot behind the ear.
Okay.
Okay, that's the first shot.
Okay.
Okay.
Where does it come out? Where's the exit wound on that?
Well, it eventually comes out the other side, but it doesn't kill her.
That's what's amazing.
Yeah, it's the second shot that was slipped underneath her shoulder blade and fired that severs her aorta, that kills her instantly.
But you can see where she's first shot behind the ear. So someone probably came up behind her, shoots her, should have been a death shot, isn't. She gets away, there's blood on a tree nearby.
Right.
A struggle, she's fighting, and then finally the second shot, because of where the blood patterns are,
Right.
Many feet away. This guy gets framed. So when you decide to investigate that murder, well, the moment your investigation begins, the whole case has already happened, right? It's been pinned on Ray Crump. He's gotten off.
Right.
In fact, you're not the first author to want to write her story.
Right.
How many people were there that?
Well, there's a woman by the name of Nina Burley who wrote the first book about Mary. It's called A Very Private Woman. Nina, she's a journalist. In my opinion, she doesn't really do a lot of research. The secret to understanding a lot of what happened is to really take the trial transcript, which is about 1,000 pages long, and just
talk about the Ray Crump trial.
Well, not the Ray Crump trial, yes, but around Mary Meyer's murder trial, right? And so, the first author, a man by the name of Leo D'Amour, was totally mesmerized by Mary Meyer, and I was so intrigued by Leo and what he was attempting to do that I just begged him to meet with me. And I drove down to Connecticut. And we spent one day together. And he realized that, I could help him in terms of the people that I knew, that kind of thing. But Leo D'Amour was a very assiduous researcher. And when I took this on, I went out and found his research assistant who had actually saved all of Leo's research. He had it, and I bought it from him right on the spot. I wrote him a check for several $1,000s and hauled it back in a broken suitcase because it was just so important that I have this material. And then, of course, it took many months of just taking the material apart. But, I had the original interview with Leo and Timothy Leary together, which was just priceless. There were some wonderful pieces of information that really helped put this whole thing together for me.
Why didn't Leo finish the book?
He committed suicide.
Do you have a sense someone got to him?
Very likely. Yeah. Leo was depressed. There were calls that he made to me that were clearly of the nature of Leo was coming apart. And I said, Leo, look, you need help. You've got to get to a facility, a psychiatric facility, because you need some intervention here to be able to just hold what was going on. But he never really got there. And he shot himself in the presence of a nurse.
Was he, Nina didn't connect these two incidences together, Mary's murder and the assassination of JFK?
Not initially. I think she has now.
But was that the direction he was heading with the story?
Absolutely. Yeah. Leo was convinced that JFK's assassination was a government job, and then, he brought that same kind of commitment for examination and research to Mary's murder. And he knew Leo and this attorney, W. Roundtree, became friends. And I have the recordings, of them talking about this case. And that was a gold mine for me in terms of, what he was onto and what she was doing with all of this.
But Dovey, the lawyer that defends this black man, Ray Crump, she has no idea throughout the entire case any affiliation that Mary has with JFK, does she? Or is there
not immediately, but I think by the end of the trial she had.
Okay.
I'm also the woman who wrote Dovey's biography. Her name is Katie McCabe. She and I are very, very close friends because we were going through this together. You know, she was writing this book about Dovey. I was writing this book about Mary. And, you know, we kind of discovered each other and began to share, you know, everything that, you know, we had come in contact with. So that was one of the reasons why the book became what it was. My book came what it was, because I really was able to finally bring the picture of this story into a place where I made intelligence out of it. I didn't leave a lot of unanswered questions.
It's the most researched book I've ever read.
Yeah.
I mean, you cover, recordings and writings and transcripts of the trials, you know, and your own personal family histories. And I think because you knew those people, somehow they let you in. And what was the first? I mean, was this the third edition right now?
Yeah, that's the third and final.
You keep getting new information and going back to it and say, wait, I gotta add this. I have new information.
The thing that I don't go into a lot there is that, you know, while I was a student at Princeton, I had this relationship with one of my professors who's still alive today, is in his 90s. His name is Martin Duberman. He's very famous. I mean, if you Google him, you would see. And I watched this guy like a hawk because he was working on book projects all through the time that I knew him. And I just realized that I've got to be with this guy. I mean, he can teach me a lot. So he was living in New York. He would commute to Princeton. I would go into New York sometimes and, you know, take him out to dinner or whatever. But I would get to talk to him and say, well, how did you do this? How did you do that? And I really learned the art of research by having a teacher like that. And when I, you know, caught up with Marty and a number of years ago, I gave him a copy of the book and I said, this is the monster you produced. And he took the book and he actually read it cover to cover. And he got back to me. He said, you know, you did an incredible, outstanding job here. I'm very impressed by, you know, your commitment and what you did here. And I said, that's because of you and, you know, what you taught me. And I think he really understood that.
How long did it take you to write the first edition?
Oh, God. Well, the first edition came out in 2012. So I would say 4 solid years of doing nothing else. I mean, that every day I would work on it, you know. It also meant a certain amount of travel, that there were people that I would have to go find and coax them into talking to me and that kind of thing. It was a very expensive proposition, but it was like, you know, this is it, man.
There were several decades then from her death to where you actually start this process.
Yes, that's
so
right.
It haunts you from the moment you hear about it, the year and come back from a Thanksgiving dinner. But it's not till decades later that you just
I didn't
made you just say,
well,
I'm going to do this.
It took a lot of courage. You know, it's like I had never written a book before. I mean, I'd written a few things. And when I put my mind to it, I'm generally a pretty good writer. But taking on a project of this magnitude and, you know, having to deal with my own perfectionistic attributes, you know, I just had to, you know, put my head down and go for it. The interesting thing that I think is important is, like Mary, I became a real acolyte of psychedelics. I discovered, holy shit, these things are really powerful. They are really so profoundly important in terms of healing, of opening myself up to deeper realities. So, I mean, I wasn't the kind of person who would take LSD and jump from one rooftop to the next. That's, I would sometimes if I used a psychedelic, uh, it would take me 2 or 3 days from beginning to end, and in terms of really sitting down and feeling the impact of what I had discovered by doing this, and it was just very important.
Well, I'm glad. Let's get into that because it's a fascinating part of this story.
Yes, it is.
And you had glanced on it earlier. In the end, Timothy Leary, arguably, I think the most famous name when we talk about LSD. Just a little personal thing. In another lifetime, I was an actor and performer in New York, and I played George Berger in Hair, the musical, as the Broadway touring company all over Europe. So we sang about Timothy. They sang about in the show about LSD. My parents marched in the '60s, which sort of brings me into this.
How old are you?
I'm 55. I just turned 55 years old.
Wow. Okay.
So my parents, I was born in 1970, right out of, I guess, the summer of love, you could call it. But they were very, I was raised by, I always say, hippies. That went on and had very productive lives. My dad's a minister, so I've always been fascinated by that time period, too. That you I'm sure found yourself in the middle of. But why did Timothy Leary have to be, interviewed as a part of a story about JFK's love interest? How does she first meet Timothy Leary?
She shows up at his office in Cambridge unannounced. And she is such an attractive, beautiful woman that Leary cannot say no to her in terms of wanting to talk with her. And so he brings her, she goes into his office and they begin to converse. And I think it's at that point that she tells Leary what she has in mind, that she wants to learn how to guide people using psychedelics, and that she has a group of women in Washington, one of whom is Katharine Graham, the editor of the Washington Post, who, want to explore the use of these substances. And so Leary sees an opportunity in terms of his work having potentially a huge impact in some way, shape, or form. And he trusts her, so he starts giving her not only really fine samples of, psilocybin. I think it was really his biggest thing. But, books for her to read, articles for her to read. And so they develop this relationship. And he is very influential with Mary in terms of just helping her getting started on completing this vision.
Just because I imagine as I'm sitting here, there's people that don't know who Timothy Leary is. So, gets very involved in LSD. In what year? What year does he start, seeing it as a way to help people?
I would say he's into it during the late 50s, but it really starts to gel in the 60s. Okay. And by the late 60s, like I would say 65, 66 and beyond, he has established his firmament in terms of being an influence in our culture.
And he even had to flee the country at a certain point.
Right.
right? Why
Right.
why did he leave the country? Who was after him?
I think he felt that the government would be after him, because they couldn't control him and they couldn't control what was going on in our culture in terms of people's using these substances and the impact and potential for change that they had.
And so what is so amazing about these interviews with Timothy Leary is she obviously is very tight-lipped about who she's talking about. He just has these, rough glimpses of, she came to me and said, I have essentially 8 women, I think it was 8, that are wives of some of the most powerful people in government,
That's right.
and I want to turn them on.
Right.
And he's in for the ride. Let me
Right.
help you, whoever these women are.
Right.
Let me
Because
help you do this.
He sees the possibility of what this could do, in terms of a very positive impact. And I think he's so taken with Mary, not just because of her physical beauty as a woman, but in terms of her own personal evolution, that, she's not bullshitting. Yeah. I mean, she's really sincere, given her own experience already, as to the potential importance that an event like this can have individually as well as, in a group.
I think what's interesting is I think when we think about LSD, you think about flower power, hippies, runners. That wasn't really who she was, right?
She's much too private for that.
Yeah. So this is a much more private experience. Not to be out in the park running around chasing butterflies. She really was like, this is something bigger than that.
Well, when she started to get into it, I mean, she was working with, I know at least 1, maybe 2 psychiatrists in California who already were aware of the potential ramifications of these kinds of substances. And she did, guided sessions. She wasn't just going to, drop acid on a Sunday afternoon because the sun was shining. She had a real calling to understand the importance and potential impact of a substance like this, and she wanted to make use of it.
Do you have any sense of the 8 women she's referring to when she says, I have the wives of the most powerful people in Washington?
Well, I know who a couple of them are.
Yeah.
One of them was this woman, Anne Chamberlain, who was also not only a friend of Mary's, but, a friend of my mother's. And, Anne wouldn't talk to me. I mean, she was just adamant, just mean, about wanting to discuss anything with me about it. And she's died. But, one of them, the other person was Angleton's wife, Cicely Angleton.
John Angleton.
Yeah.
Who was a major player in the CIA, manipulating. It seems like a very dark human being.
James Jesus Angleton.
Yeah. James, I mean, yeah.
Yeah. Yes. Very dark.
And so his wife is doing these sessions.
Yeah. And of course, Angleton, and of course, the CIA is involved with psychedelics, wanting to see, wow, how can we use this? What can we do as an entity to really get what we need or influence the people we want to, whatever. But, there was a whole group within the CIA that were into psychedelics and just trying to research, the incredible impact of what they could do.
Did you interview Leary?
No.
So it's all done by Leo.
Leo has a great interview with Leary. And I have a recording of it. If you'd like to hear it, I would be glad to give it to you.
Yeah, that'd be fascinating.
Yeah, you would like it. You would definitely like it. And Nina Burley got a chance to interview Leary. I don't know how that interview really went because I just. Nina's would not be the person that I would want to do that. But she did get the opportunity to talk to him. And I think, Leary certainly communicated to her how impressed he was with Mary and how much he trusted her.
And then eventually she has a new story. She comes to him, and now it's not 8 women. She basically describes, I have one of the most powerful men in the world.
Meaning JFK.
Well, that's what I'm asking you.
Yeah.
Right? That's all he says. He doesn't know who she's talking about.
Exactly. I mean, I think he eventually put 2 and 2 together.
The question I guess, that is so riveting is, do you think Mary Pinchot Meyer, gave JFK LSD or psilocybin, a hallucinogen? Do you
They
think
did it. They did one trip together.
Yeah.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
So the president of the United States, while he's the president,
Yes.
in the middle of some of the most important negotiations ever around world peace, in the middle of the closest we've ever been to nuclear war.
It was in the spring of 1962.
They drop acid together?
Psilocybin.
So mushrooms.
It was a mild dose of psilocybin.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. It was not LSD. But
Okay.
it was still, I mean, JFK was very curious about it because Mary had told him that the only way that she had been able to deal with the death of her second son was because of the assistance that psychedelics had given her in terms of dealing with her own grief. I mean, she was devastated by Michael's death. But this really, her experience with psychedelics really allowed her to resolve this in such a way that she went on to continue her journey and her impact.
And she obviously believed that he needed to have this enlightenment of some kind, given the power and the importance of what he was doing in this journey for world peace.
Well, they talked about it a lot, and he was very intrigued by it. He knew that, for instance, his sister-in-law, Ethel Kennedy, had some trouble with alcoholism and had dealt with it by having a psychedelic session or two. I had always wanted to ask Bobby Jr., could he substantiate this? But I never have met him to ask him or would want to ever bring it up unless he was willing to talk about it.
Right. So, and they also smoked pot.
Oh, a number of times. Yeah.
In the White House?
Yeah. Yeah. In the White House residence.
So do we have evidence that a sitting president got stoned in the White House?
Well, it depends what you would call evidence.
Okay.
I don't have a recording of it, but it's actually, the description of it came from a mutual friend of Mary's who is a journalist, a guy named Jim Truitt, who was able to get a lot of information as to, what had taken place.
Did she tell him, or was he there? Did she tell him that they smoked pot in the White House, or was he actually in the room when that had happened?
No, he was not in the room when it happened. No.
All right. But she was sharing this with close people that were close to her.
Yeah. I mean, Mary, she loved cannabis,
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know if it was an everyday affair for her, but, increasingly, I think it became, I mean, she was not a drinker. And so this would have been, an avenue for her to just relax, open up a little bit, and just, go with the flow.
What do you think about that? Since you did from the very beginning, you talked about your own experiences there with LSD. For someone that hasn't done LSD or psilocybin or any of those things, what would be significant about a president in the middle of one of the most dangerous times we've ever seen doing a drug like that?
Well, I think he knew that it was not, I mean, they only did it once, as far as I have been able to see. And it did have an impact on him. It's not like he wanted to rush in, oh, let's do it again tonight, that kind of thing. But I think with Mary, they really spent a lot of time sort of processing, not only during the actual trip itself, but post, in terms of what would come up afterwards. And, taking a psychedelic with a romantic partner it can be a profoundly powerful experience in terms of just removing barriers, getting rid of fear of one kind or another, fostering a deeper connection in the relationship. I mean, it's huge. And that's why one of the biggest revolutions in mental health today is it's called psychedelic assisted psychotherapy.
Yeah. It's amazing. There's a lot of, I know right now with Robert Kennedy Jr., Marty McCary at FDA, I know for a fact there's a lot of people trying to discuss, can we open up these channels quicker? There's so much being done with PTSD in military coming back, getting their lives back together through whether it's Ibogaine or, some of these other, I guess, what do we call them? Natural origin drugs out of South America. And, things like that. And to imagine John F. Kennedy, I mean, it really does, and what you so beautifully portray in this book is that there's a vision for a different way that the world can be. He's working with Khrushchev. I mean, he really broke down barriers as quietly, and you can say, dangerously so. I mean, I think there's even, not to compare them, but Donald Trump's desire to want to talk to Putin, he catches a lot of heat. It would have been the same thing, I think, for JFK to know, wait a minute, you're going around us and having a private conversation with our enemy. How dare you? Who do you think you are? Do you imagine, and when you wrote this book, when you do this investigation, how is the world different if JFK is not assassinated? Does he win the next election?
I would say absolutely yes. I think he would have, hands down.
Does the CIA exist, or does he break into him?
Well, he neuters the CIA. I mean, the CIA still exists, but it doesn't have the independence that it thought it would have to do willy-nilly anything that it wants, whenever it wants. No, he would not have allowed that to, nor does it have the capacity to, overcome democracy. Yes, I think your question is a very important one. We would be living in a very different world today had JFK lived. And he would have ended up with Mary. I mean, that they would have for sure been together.
You think that would?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I'm just convinced of it.
Because even Jacqueline Kennedy, you write in the book, she was off with Onassis.
Right.
They had, John F. Kennedy and her had run their course.
I think so. But, I will tell you not to, look like a fool. I mean, there are times in my life where both Mary and JFK show up in my consciousness. I mean, it's really palpable. It's real. And we talk, There are things that they want to tell me. There are questions that I want to ask. And they are alive and well in another dimension, and they are true soulmates in the best sense of what that means.
I think I want to just say for viewers out there that the way you're talking spiritually about this connection with them is not how the book reads at all. I don't want to give people an impression that somehow you're coming. It's so, data driven fact. You know what I mean? Not that what you're saying isn't, I
Right.
agree with you. I just want, people to know that I think this is sort of a revelation that comes from your deep interaction with this story.
Yes.
To sort of bring this full circle for this book, you're making, you make the point ultimately to prove that Mary Pinchot is assassinated also probably by many of the same players that assassinated JFK. Why would they assassinate her? What was it, why would they have even cared about her?
Because she would have disclosed what she had found out through her own independent research that would made the Warren Commission report look like the crock of shit, forgive my French, for what it was. She would have just riddled the government's case as to its attempt to cloud or shroud over the real truth as to why JFK was assassinated. And they knew that. They knew that if she went public in a way with what she knew, the whole game was over.
Was she getting restless? Did she let someone know, or that she was going to come out and say something?
Yes.
Who?
She let a couple of people know that was her intention. What she didn't realize and was always a little bit, in my opinion, too naive about was that, Angleton had her phone tapped. I mean, he knew everything she was talking about. And, they had people watching her. And that's when they knew that if we let this woman go and she starts running her mouth with what she has really discovered, we're going to look like the fools that we really are.
In the murder investigation, in the trial, and then really, and you do make this, what's so interesting about this journey is also how you discover things is an important timeline of what's happening, the timeline of how you're discovering it. You weave them beautifully. When she's murdered, the night, where does she live at that time? She's living, or actually she has an art house. She does her painting in a building on somebody else's property.
She lives on 34th Street in Washington.
Okay.
It's about a 10-minute walk from her studio, which is on top of Ben Bradley's garage.
So Ben Bradley, the editor-in-chief of, or
at that point, he's the managing editor of the Washington Post.
Of the Washington Post.
Yeah, he hasn't become the executive editor.
Okay.
But he's very high up. And Katharine Graham is watching him and grooming him,
And Katharine Graham's relevance to the paper is...
She owns the Washington Post.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. And they're all friends,
Oh, yeah.
Bradley, Katharine Graham, Mary Pinchot. But some of where you really, if you're going to take this out of, a black gentleman in a park killing her, there's several different stories that don't add up that get told differently over time. One of them is how they get into, who goes into her, painting studio at Bradley's house. The night of her murder, ultimately, who do you think went in there?
Bradley and James Jesus Angleton. And Bradley gets seduced by Angleton and turns over her diary, which is in her studio, to Angleton, because he thinks, the CIA are the right people to have this, and we've got to keep it under the lid.
Her diary would be, I'm sure, devastating, filled with everything, probably even hallucination trips with
According to Leo
JFK.
D'Amour, he saw parts of it. He was able to read parts of it because it also got into the hands of another journalist. I forget his name, but it's in the book. But yeah, I mean, the diary, I think, was destroyed. Unfortunately, we'll never get to see it, but it certainly would have been the MacGuffin of, this caper had we been able to see what was in there.
It would seem curious to me that a Washington Post, up and coming editor would hand over a diary to the CIA under the belief that why would you be doing that the night that a random vagrant or, drunken black guy killed your friend in a park? What would that have to do with the CIA? Why are you even involved? Like, why are you and the CIA breaking into her studio to get her diary? Really, you start painting this picture that Bradley is not telling us the truth on who he really is or what his passions are.
Not totally. But I think Bradley, being in his position that he is, he too is also intimidated by the CIA. And if Angleton basically is saying, look, we have got to have this. We have got to protect this document. I want to take it out to the agency, do this or that.
And Bradley did know. He was close enough to Mary to know that she had a relationship with JFK.
Oh,
so
yeah.
maybe
Yeah.
he said, let's just wrap that up. We don't need that
Exactly.
making the world a messy place.
Exactly.
All right, I want to get to one of the things, this multi-hour, and you get into detail in the very beginning of the book, the murder scene, who's there, who's not there, the witnesses, all the things that are sort of wrapped around this. But there's a very important phone call that is delivered, and I'm not. It's been a little while. Is it Bradley that receives a phone call that I believe Mary Pinchot Myers may have been killed? Someone receives a phone call.
It's one of Mary's friends. Her name is Anne Truitt.
Okay.
Yeah, and she's in Japan at the time, and she is calling Bradley.
Okay.
To just talk to him about what has happened, because she has already gotten wind of the fact that her dear friend Mary has been murdered. And of course, everyone is very, very upset.
And how does she know she's been murdered?
Probably because of Angleton or someone who knows Angleton. News travels very, very fast in a situation like this. And, Anne Truitt, Cicely Angleton, or a couple of others, Anne Chamberlain, these are Mary's bosom buddies. And so as soon as Mary is ultimately identified at the murder scene, and word starts to get out, it travels very, very fast, particularly to these very special people.
But there's also knowledge of her before the word gets out. Isn't there, inside of some of the powers that be, that ultimately, I think one of the great revelations in your book, as you're doing this investigation, comes around to your own father.
Right.
Take me into that revelation. What was it about?
I will never know what he ultimately knew or didn't know with regard to this. I know he knew more than he ever let on. But the fact is that my father was not part of the clandestine dimension of the CIA. He was one of the few people that had graduated from Yale with a master's degree in Russian area studies. And that's why Alan Dulles felt he was so important to be part of the CIA. But he was not a CIA agent, secret agent of that kind of thing. However, he certainly was very well aware of what the CIA was doing at any given time. And because of the clearance that he had within the agency, there wasn't any reason to keep anything from him. So,
is he involved in any sort of the communications around her ultimate assassination?
I don't know the answer to that. I would sit here and say that I think it's highly probable and possible, but I can't tell you that I know that for sure. I mean, given, the nature of what took place and the truth of what took place, I do think he was in the know of the reality that the CIA was instrumental in taking her out.
So when you reflect back now on that Thanksgiving dinner coming back from boarding school and your mother says, Mary Pinchot Meyer's been murdered, and your dad just sits there staring quietly, you see that moment differently now than you experienced it.
Oh, yeah. Because I realize that at some level, he is aware of what has taken place and why it has taken place.
Because your mother is telling a story about a black man in a park that killed our friend.
Right.
And your father's sitting there knowing a completely different story.
Exactly. Exactly. Yeah.
When you're asked who killed John F. Kennedy, what's your response to that after all the research that you've done?
Well, it depends who I'm talking to. But, one of the first things I would say is that there were forces within our own government that felt that he needed to be removed because he was a threat to any number of people within the government or in terms of what our government was up to.
What is your hope with this book as you write? There's now, you have multiple series they're looking at turning into documentary series. I mean, it would make an amazing movie.
Miniseries.
Miniseries,
yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Leo DiCaprio, between you and me, wants to play JFK.
Wow.
Yeah. His father can't get enough of this. I mean, his father is leading the charge with Apple to, come on, cough up the money. Let's get this done. You know how important it is. It'll be on the Apple platform, But this has got to be done.
I actually know George DiCaprio.
Oh, you do?
Because of some of the work I've done. Great guy.
Yeah.
Really great guy.
Well, my producer in Hollywood, his name is David Womark, very well-known guy, very good friends with George.
Yeah.
And, George is always plugging him. David is always plugging George. Yeah, we're going to get it done, George. Documentary's going first, but this will light the fuse to get the miniseries underway.
It would be spectacular. And
I didn't tell you who wants to play Mary.
No. Are you going to?
Yeah, I will. I'm just I'm spacing on her name. Who's the blonde woman?
Scarlett Johansson.
There it is. Yeah.
Okay. Yes. Boy, I should be playing charades today.
Yeah. Right. Yeah, I mean, her agent is, she's talking to her agent about this, and I mean, he keeps, according to what I hear, she keeps saying, look, I want to be on the list. Okay. I mean, tell me I'm on the list. Okay. Because this is a story that's never going to come down the pike again. Anyone who's an A-list actress in Hollywood looks at this story and says, holy shit, if I could have that role, my professional life would be complete, provided, you know, you have the right screenwriter, director, that kind of thing.
Well, I mean, because I think, Jacqueline Kennedy has been done many, many times. Those movies have been there. And in this book, you capture someone that shockingly none of us know about.
Right.
And maybe one of the most important women in the history of, certainly in the history of America, but also around this one of the most tumultuous, conspiracy-filled spaces. The woman at the center of is Mary Pinchot Meyer.
Right.
And you say now that you believe you were put on this earth to tell this story.
Right.
Why is Mary's story this important?
Because I think it brings into focus the real truth about a historical period in our country that we have been denied from knowing the truth, and that our government has gotten away with just lies year after year after year about stepping up and taking on the truth and admitting, yes, we assassinated a sitting president. Yes, we assassinated his true soulmate as well 10 months later. That's the truth. And yet we, like so many parts of our country's history, we don't know the real truth about many important things.
Because even though this is a nation that's supposed to be of, for, and by the people, they don't really trust the people.
Right. Right. And they don't want people to know too much that could create more trouble. They want to maintain their sense of control over the narrative.
I want to thank you for taking the time.
Yeah, man.
Just, in this interview, but in this book.
Well,
for everybody out there, you do not, before superstars start jumping all over this and you have a movie, you should really check this book out. It's stunning.
And let me just say, I think you were possibly the best interviewer I've ever worked with, and I've done more than 50 of these in terms of your commitment to the story, your enthusiasm, but really your ability to cut to the chase on what's the real question here. I think you did a great job.
Thank you very much. It means a lot.
Yeah.
By someone did this amazing job.
Yeah.
On telling this story.
Absolutely.
It's an honor to meet you.
Yes, and you. And we will be in touch.
Okay.
Okay.
Great.